I'm sure most of you have been following what's been going on in Lebanon over the past week or so, and we have today Emil Haqqani, our Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Security, to brief us on it. I'm sure, again, most of you know who Emil is, but just in case you don't, he specialises in political and conflict analysis, covers the war in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In fact, he covers basically huge amounts of stuff in the Middle East, so I'll cut that short. He's been with us for about 10 years. He previously worked as a political editor and international affairs columnist at the National Abu Dhabi, and before that he worked at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and he provides analysis regularly to the media, to corporations, and to governments. He's going to educate us about what's going on in Lebanon, but I think a couple of questions he's going to cover is, first of all, will the Hariri government collapse under popular pressure? And how are the main political forces, most notably Hezbollah, responding to the challenge? Can a technocratic cabinet be formed and obtain international backing, or is major change unlikely? And what's the impact on Lebanon's regional predicament? So Emil will talk for about maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. So Emil, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I would have much preferred to be in Beirut these days. It's more fun. It doesn't rain like crazy. But I'm glad to be giving you a sense of what's happening on the streets of the homeland. If anything, it's been quite entertaining. So if you feel a bit down, turn on television, go on Twitter. It's quite fun to watch the protest movement. It has produced some of the best jokes and best humor I've seen in recent times. And, that's the Mediterraneans for you. They always find a reason to protest even under the most dire circumstances. More seriously, it's important to understand a few things about the situation. I think, especially for observers of the Levant in general, we have the tendency to praise the Lebanese for their feigned resilience, which I think was misguided and naive at best, and harmful in reality. That resilience that we saw in the past few years as Syria disintegrated, as regional tensions escalated, as economic conditions worsened across the region, etc., that wasn't really resilience. That was avoidance of the hard decision, hard issues. It was essentially surfing in the hope of a soft landing, even as the structural conditions were worsening and were just leading the country towards a hard landing. And I'm not sure it's going to be a landing. So basically, what we've seen in the past 10 years is a rapid erosion of governance, of living conditions, of state-society relations, etc. So what we see today, in a way, is it's no real surprise, but the surprise is that it came quite late in the process, and I will argue that it perhaps came too late to really make a difference at this point. Now, let's be positive for a few minutes before the gloom. This is an unprecedented movement in Lebanese history. And even in comparison to the 2005 massive demonstrations. In 2005, the driver was a foreign occupation. It was a matter of sovereignty. The coming together was real, but at the same time shallow in terms of the governance issues. It was essentially about pushing Syria out of Lebanon. There was a common denominator, but it was not something that would necessarily give coherence to the country, and in fact, it actually led to a profound divide in the country. This movement is unprecedented for a number of reasons. The first one is that it is the first nationwide movement in the history of Lebanon. It is not a Beirut-only or Beirut-centric movement where mostly elites or people from all over the country go to downtown Beirut and do it. I'm looking at the news coverage, the online coverage all the time. It's everywhere. It's in towns that we never thought about. It's in places that tend to be quite tame or conservative. It's from Nabatieh, which is a large city in the Shia-dominated south, to Tripoli and Akka, which are Sunni towns and regions in the north. It is along the highways, it's in small villages, a bit everywhere. So the nationwide nature of the movement is quite stunning. So that's number one. The second one is that this is the first non-sectarian movement. Previous demonstrations were not non-sectarian, they were cross-sectarian. It meant that people from different religious groups and whatever came together, accepted their differences, but maintained their identity, as members of their specific community. This is a non-sectarian movement in the sense that people don't define themselves by their religion. It's not that, I'm Sunni, you're Shia, and we're coming together, right? They don't want to assume this role, these identities, and that's also quite important. A third point is that this is really a youth-dominated movement. My dad, who's a young man, despite being 70, sorry for anyone here saying, but went down to the protests. His 3 kids live abroad. He's quite sad about it, but he decided to represent us. And he came back. He's like, Emil, I was the oldest. I mean, this is a new generation, and I'm not romanticizing this. This is the generation that's going to live Lebanon at its worst. This is the generation that has probably the most difficult set of circumstances ahead of them. So they are showing an awareness about their current and probable future living conditions. The older generations, first, some of them are bruised, some of them are tired, they don't necessarily have the energy into this, but it's quite telling, not just from the visuals, but from the people who are emerging from the streets, that this is a movement dominated by those who are less than 40. Another interesting feature is the absence or the very low profile of traditional political parties. And I'll talk about entrism in a second, but in previous large-scale demonstrations, political parties tend to be quite represented, would put up their flags despite calls for, only Lebanese flags, etc. This has changed. This is the few political actors who tried to make it. I mean, I can think of Musbah al-Ahdab in Tripoli or Sami Jmail in Jaladib or whatever. Sorry, I'm throwing names at you. They were shut down by the crowd. They were told, you're part of the problem. In previous demonstrations, it was like my argument about the previous ones being cross-sectarian. They were cross-political. They would come from everywhere. They would hang out together. Those political leaders. It would look good. The picture would look good. Oh, Lebanon is similar. There's an active rejection of those political parties. Another feature is that this is first and foremost an anti-system movement. It's not nihilistic. It's not anarchical movement. It's anti-system, and it's building on civil society dynamics that have been quite powerful in recent years. The 2015 garbage crisis, if you've ever followed that one, Beirut Madinati, which was the challenge from civil society groups to mainstream parties in municipal elections in Beirut. They did quite well. There's a number of other incidents along the way. So there's been a slow build-up, a slow movement of anger towards the state and political parties. That's quite there, and in the minds of members of this movement, there's the crystallization that the system itself is what generates the corruption, the mismanagement, the brutality. It's not about actors. It's not, necessarily about foreign powers, which can intervene, exacerbate, or not. But it's the system in and of itself that never rewards or never encourages competence, transparency, change, etc. And that's quite that was an argument that was made in the intellectual circle for a long time. But now the street has, embraced it, and that's also important. Another important feature in that, it's not of these protests, it's not that it's just anti-system, it's anti-zu'ama in the system. So the Zu'ama are the leaders of community within the community. It is the first time we see direct challenge in the Sunni community in such terms to Saad Hariri or Najib Miati. In the Shia community to Nabih Berri or Hassan Nasrallah. In the Christian community to Jumayy al-Aun, Ja'ja, etc. What I'm trying to say is that the politics now exists within community. And that is also a very important development. I would say the most notable, there was always discontent within communities against our leadership, but the most notable point here has to do with the Shia community. It was very difficult to express opposition to the leadership of Nabih Berri, who's the Speaker of Parliament since 1992, or to Hezbollah, which is the most dominant political and military force in the country in recent times. But this has happened. Kfar Amal, Nabatieh, Sur, I'm throwing at you names of cities that exist in the deep Shia south, where you've had large protests. They were not necessarily welcomed. In fact, there were instances of violence in Nabatieh, in Sur. There were casualties, etc. Whether it's Nabih Berri or the Hezbollah leadership, it's the first time the contestation doesn't come from outside the community, which means that they cannot necessarily resort to traditional sectarian responses to keep cohesion within the community. And finally, and I say this because I'm starting to see those op-eds and so on, these protests are about governance and socio-economic issues. They're not about geopolitics. I already see people writing op-eds saying this is a slap in the face of Iran. This is not about Iran. It's against Iran-backed leaders in some conditions. It's the case in Iraq. It's the case in Lebanon. But it's not about Iran or the U.S. for that matter or anyone else, right? But Iran being the more the lightning rod here, it's worse. So, and finally, what I would say on this part is that the difficulty in Lebanon compared to other Arab states is that the Lebanese system is not an authoritarian one. Okay, it leaves enough space for people to express themselves politically, to demonstrate, and so on. So this is not comparable to Algeria or Sudan or whatever. If you want to compare the situation, the closest to this are the demonstrations in Iraq in the past few months. You have states that under-deliver, that are brutal, that are incompetent, corrupt, whatever, but that are not. You can't define them as authoritarian per se. Careful, the responses can be quite bloody. We saw that in Iraq. Certainly in Lebanon, it's possible, but that's the right frame. So yes, it's part of the Arab uprising since 2011, the greater public consciousness of all these issues. But we have to be careful about how we characterize that. Now, why has this happened now? It's happened now because of convergence of crisis that compound the other. It's just the news looks quite grim if you're sitting in Beirut these days. First, the economic crisis has hit the country really hard. I think GDP growth for next year is projected to be 0%, and that was before the demonstration. I expect that they will be even lower. Credit agencies have, consider Lebanon T-bills as junk at this point in a number of cases. The economic model is not sustainable with the massive corruption in its management. It's a country that cannot produce more than the average 8 hours of electricity a day in the wealthy areas. I'm not even talking about the rest of the country, and that's been going on for 25 years. And one of the funniest video to look at is every minister of energy in the past 15 years telling the Lebanese public that next year you will have 24 hours. And every year for the past 15 years you have the minister of energy making the same speech, and it doesn't get better. If anything, it gets worse. On top of that, you have the garbage crisis, you have environmental crisis, you have crisis of employment, and then you have the massive issue of the debt. Lebanon is a country that produces little and that it imports massively. So there's a need for hard dollars, currency. but the Lebanese pound is pegged to the dollar at 1,500 liras, which basically means that the central bank needs a constant inpouring, not outpouring, of dollars. And, well, this is drying up. There's less Lebanese making money in the Gulf. There's some harsher conditions around the world. So the debt kept on going up. At this point, I think it's 150% debt to GDP ratio, which is one of the highest in the world, which means that the servicing of the debt is massive. It's the biggest item in the budget. The governance crisis, which I have alluded to before, not a single public service has improved. Actually, anyone who lands in Beirut today compares the state of the airport in Beirut today compared 10 years ago, and it's like, what? Even worse, there is a garbage dumping site not far, so when you get out of the airport, you also have to do that because, for a good 15 minutes to get out of the danger zone. So the decay of the infrastructure is quite impressive. Unemployment is rising, and the typical places where young Lebanese used to go in the Gulf states and Europe and so on, it's much more difficult to get visas and work permits. Another crisis has to do with Lebanon's relations with foreign powers. Lebanese elites, out of complacency, out of laziness, out of many other things, took international support for Lebanon for granted. And there was a time where it was understandable, Jacques Chirac loved Lebanon, and George Bush, during this last year discovered that Lebanese democracies were a great thing, so he pronounced the words 10 times a day. There was an interest in the country, right? I would say it was an oversized interest. Lebanon is not that strategic. It didn't warrant that. But guess what? It used to be in the top 5 issues in the Middle East at any one point, right? It never really dropped off the radar. Now it's probably issue number 27, 43, you tell me. When Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen are blowing up, when Algeria and Sudan are going on through transitions and so on. The Lebanese expect the world to still want to pour billions of dollars and political attention and so on into managing problems that look intractable. But it's difficult if you are part of the Lebanese political elite and you've grown used to, foreign leaders caring about you and saying the name of your country every other day. You think you're more important than you are, and so the landing is difficult. So it doesn't mean that the international community is no longer interested, but it's interested in short-term shoring up. We don't want another catastrophe. We don't want another country collapsing. So it's much more about doing the minimum to prevent a total disaster than actually saying, okay, you need to get your act together and you're not going to get any help until you do so. Right? So that has actually, there is moral hazard that actually has fueled some of the worst behavior of the Lebanese. Another dynamic to keep in mind is that the fate of Lebanon was always going to depend on the outcome in Syria. Okay? Up until 2016, when there were question marks about the fate of Assad and what the future Syria would look like, there was a political game, there was positioning. Anti-Syrian forces felt that they had room to operate. It was bruising at times. A number of anti-Syrian figures were killed in the process, Mohammed Shattah and others. But there seems to be like a kind of an opportunity on the horizon if there was real change in Damascus. Well, it didn't happen, and the politics of Lebanon were massively influenced by that. So in late 2016, the deal between Michel Aoun, the current president, and Saad Hariri, the current prime minister, one who ended up being pro-Syria after fighting it, and the other one being anti-Syria after being both Syria, whatever. That's Lebanon, it's good to say. They made that deal in large part because of how Syria was developing. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the main drivers there. And since 2016, what happened is, as the sense that Assad was reasserting itself, that the regional powers were going to accept that he's the ruler in Damascus for the foreseeable future, that he's getting international acquiescence, was a Russian, Western, or whatever. The Lebanese are basically telling themselves, okay, including the anti-Syrian camp, we have to survive that new phase. Is going to be quite difficult. We have two borders, one with Syria, the other one with Israel. How do you export your agricultural production? How do you deal with Syrian refugees? How do you rebuild logistical links to Iraq? How do you fly over Syria? I mean, all these issues come back to the agenda, on top of the political security issue inside the country, which is that the pro-Syrian camp feels much more emboldened, is that they won. The bet that they made on Assad has worked. Now, another dynamic in this context, which is quite important, is the growing Saudi and Gulf disinterest in Lebanon. The Saudi in particular, but also other Gulf states, have poured billions of dollars, political capital, and much more into Lebanon since the 90s. I mean, even before, but since the 90s, I'd say. And if you sit in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi these days, you look at Lebanon and you say, you know what, this is actually a sunk cost. We should look at it as sunk cost. We never won anything in Lebanon. It cost us a lot, number one. Second, the most powerful Lebanese faction, Hezbollah, is actively supporting our enemies in Yemen, the Houthis, and so on. So why are we even putting anything in this country? We lost. It's not, there's no way we can get back in the game. And our allies there are not able to fend this off. They either get killed or they cave or they get intimidated and so on. Add to that a generational change in Riyadh and elsewhere. There were days where King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, who passed away in 2015, or Saud al-Faisal, who was the foreign minister, they grew up in Lebanon. Their best friends were Lebanese. They loved it. They loved the music. They loved the food, and so on. Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, the new crop, doesn't have this romantic notion of Lebanon. It wasn't necessarily part of their upbringing, and so the way they look at it is much more, cynical and transactional. And from that perspective, it makes sense. Okay, so that change has had a big impact also on the level of Gulf support to the country. Another thing is the emergence of Russia in the picture. And Lebanese have a lot of illusions about what Russia can and will do. Lebanese, especially the foreign minister, Gibran Bassil, think that Russia can help with Syrian refugees. The Russian plan is totally unviable, unrealistic, and it's not really a plan, and it only deals with 1/6 of the total number of refugees. But it's better to have the illusion, because that the EU, the US, and whatever can't help you. So whomever says something that sounds credible to the Lebanese, why not? They also hope that Russia is going to help with normalization with Assad, of relations. Well, Russia will encourage, but it's not going necessarily to monitor an arrangement. It's not going to offer guarantees. It's not going to make sure that Lebanese jailed in Syria are going to be released and so on. This is not what Russia wants to get involved in. So there's limits to what Russia can offer there. Russia cannot act as an economic stabilizer of Lebanon. I mean, the money is not going to come from Russia. Russia is not going to introduce or encourage or incentivize economic and social reforms, etc. So what are you going to get? Defense deals. The Lebanese thought that they can get from Russia the weaponry that they can't get from the Westerners, except that Westerners offers what Lebanese can actually use. Second, they offer them grant, where the Russians are offering credit lines, and there could be a lot of corruption on that. And anyway, the Lebanese may not get the weaponry they want, because Russia is not going to sell to the Lebanese stuff that the Israelis don't want the Lebanese to have, right? So you build this image in your head that Russia, can come and replace and help with energy exploration of, Lebanese waters in the Eastern Mediterranean, and nothing comes to fruition. I mean, it's just total frustration on that. And then internally, very tense internal relations. There's rhetoric against refugees, Palestinian and Syrian, often sectarian loaded. So it's really problematic. Of course, I don't deny that refugees are a burden, but they're not. You can't define them as a burden. They're people fleeing awful conditions. There is international assistance coming, but it has become a lightning rod, and some very brutal language has been used against the refugees, especially by our foreign minister, who distinguishes himself from this perspective. Sectarian sanctions are growing as a result. There's the famous case of a Christian mayor refusing to allow Muslims to rent in his little town. There is another Christian MP who wondered 2 weeks ago. There was a massive wave of fires across the country. Why fires only hit Christian areas and not Muslim ones? Well, they did hit Muslim ones. It's just that it's always better to engage in conspiracy theories and produce bullshit. But a lot of people, sorry, HR is not in the room. No, it's not.
It's our secret. And the recording.
But it's those kind of things. There is also sectarian rhetoric on the part of others as well, right? I mean, just to show you how stupid it is, there is the highest mountain in Lebanon is called Ornat al-Sawda, and there was and it's part of a specific province that is a Christian province. Now, because it's the highest mount, there are young Muslim guys from another province who claim that the peak is in their province. And so they went up and put a sign saying, it's our province. Not I mean, it's just stupid, but it feeds this, negative, controversial, provocative atmosphere. Now, what about the movement in those conditions? How can we assess its prospects? Well, first, the strength of the movement is also its weakness. It's that it's leaderless. It's very difficult to decapitate. It's very difficult to constrain. It's very difficult to negotiate with it, and it's difficult to contain. I mean, sorry, I just said it, but and that's a feature across popular movements in the Arab world. And sometimes you have a leadership that materializes. We saw that in Sudan, and we saw that in Algeria, for instance. Second, there is clearly, as I said, a rejection of past policies and political elites, but there's no clear economic vision that is forming on the streets either. Like, the most pressing one is, what do you do about the debt? I mean, is it a haircut a la IMF? Is that cut on public spending? Is it accepting, the French SED project or rejecting it? It's very complex. It's a complex matter, right? But it's not clear what the crowd really stands for at this moment. Another point is that this is a movement that, despite its energy and its use and so on, it's a movement that is vulnerable to political manipulation and entrism if need be. Right? It's not going to be too difficult for people to insert themselves in that movement and corrupt it or steer it in one way or another. I mean, some of the names that are emerging or that you see on television are partisan names, but then that pose as, reformist figures. Can you trust that? And I'm quite worried at that level. Now, the government itself is on a weak footing. Loss of legitimacy, no sense of momentum. The reform package that was presented is laughable. They were able to cut the budget deficit in 3 days by meetings. I mean, why haven't been able to do that in better economic times? But they still put out a reform package that supposedly will cut the budget deficit to 0%. It is still holding on to the hope that external support will come through because Lebanon is somehow too big to fail. I'm not sure I believe that. Within the government, there are real tensions between the various factions. But fundamentally, the two most powerful actors within government, Michel Aoun, the president and his faction, and Hezbollah, have no interest in or intention of compromising. Because what they saw they achieved in the presidential elections in 2016 and the national elections in 2018 is the best they could. It's in Arabic al-ahd al-qawi, the strong mandate, the strong presidency, that finally they control parliament, the presidency, and indirectly also the cabinet. And so accepting a total resignation or caving to the crowd is a loss of faith. It's a terrible situation to be in after telling everyone we seize government and now we're going to fix the country, and everything went south since 2016. Now the problem here is that Hariri, which is the prime minister and the closest to the West and quite anti-Syrian and so on, is the weakest of the three partners in government, right? He has a shrinking base. He has real troubles with Saudi Arabia. Remember his tourism visit to Riyadh, how it turned out in 2017. But his strength is that both Hezbollah and the president want him in the forefront. They need him as a cover. They need him as president. And they actually prevented him from resigning a week ago. So his strength, he has inherent political weakness, but his strength is that the other two need him. But he's not strong enough to even use that to assert himself in terms of public policy. And it shows you how bad things are. For him, it's a huge predicament. As the prime minister, he's the executive, he holds the executive branch, but he is responsible also for government paralysis and dysfunction. His fate is in the balance. If Saad Hariri resigns tomorrow, he's a non-quantity. He'll go into exile and will have no political future in Lebanon because he has spent all the goodwill, political capital that he had. It doesn't help when you pay $16 million to your girlfriend abroad.
Must be a nice girlfriend.
The Sunni community is on the defense, however, because of that. Because what happens with every crisis in Lebanon is that the person who resigns is the prime minister. And given the Lebanese constitution, the prime minister is Sunni. So it's not the president or the speaker of parliament who resign. So the Sunni community starts to feel under attack, under defense. Why isn't the president resigning? Why is the speaker of parliament the same one since 1992? And he's Shia and he's pro-Hezbollah as well, right? So it feeds the sectarian dynamics as well, which actually increase Hariri's own predicaments. Hezbollah, by the way, refused Hariri's resignation. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General, came on television and offered one of the sternest warnings in recent times because he likes it. Hariri is weak and he's a cover at the same time. He helps to preserve the illusion of a difference between state and the resistance, so Hezbollah's moniker for what it does. And Hariri has lost his political allies since 2016. Jumblat, the Druze chieftain, Jaja, a Maronite chieftain, etc. So the picture is quite complicated at this level. Hezbollah has no interest in political instability, but it has zero solution, and it's not as if Iran is going to come and fix Lebanon or pay for part of the budget or anything. That's not what Iran does. Iran wants a strong security partner that does what Iran needs it to do, from saying. Hezbollah is focused on regrouping after Syria, rebuilding its ranks, figuring out its military posture, and so on. It's focused on overcoming the harsh economic conditions on the Shia community as a whole. And right now, it's focused on facing the criticism, and soon, from within the community, which is unprecedented. I'm sure the Hezbollahis are quite concerned about it. The other big loser here is the president, Michel Aoun. His bloc is called Al-Islah wa Taghyir, the Reform and Change. But since he's come to power in 2016 and he has the largest parliamentary bloc, the largest number of MPs, the presidency, most security appointments, most administrative appointments, and so on, there's been nothing really about change or reform. So his image is hurt, and perhaps the most reviled person in Lebanon today, aside from the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, is Gibran Bassil, the Foreign Minister. I wish I could tell you about the song that is quite popular on the streets of Beirut, but I will lose my job over singing it. But it's quite telling, that the ire of the protesters is directed at the Speaker of Parliament and the Foreign Minister. Aoun himself is worried about being undermined by Christian rivals. So his media, for instance, often says that the protesters are fifth column. It's the language is becoming a much more toxic. He's even worried about being undermined by the Lebanese Armed Forces commander, who is a direct rival to the foreign minister, who is Aoun's son-in-law, for the presidency. Right. So you have this toxic. However, it seems like he gave a speech like 2 hours ago that they may go for early elections. That we'll see. Now, for the protest movement, this is a really important moment because, again, they don't necessarily agree on a lot, and the nature of the movement is complex. But they also don't agree on the next steps. Should the next steps be early elections, a technocratic government, a national unity government, a military takeover, or the resignation of all three presidents of the Republic, of the Council of Ministers, and the speakership? So what can go wrong? A lot can go wrong. I think time is in favor of the established political parties. I think the issue of entrism should not be underestimated. Provocations are quite likely, small skirmishes that escalate into something worse. Those protesting are not tough people who want blood and so on. So if this starts, they just may decide to call it a day. There's no real international and regional support for the protest movement, despite the sympathy. So, people like to see that on CNN, but, presidents are not going to spend time and capital on that. And finally, I go back. If you want to poison something like that, what you have to do is you introduce sectarianism into it. And I allude to what I was saying about the prime minister having to resign again, which will affect, for instance, the Sunni community. This is just one example. There are many others. So all in all, if you ask me, I as much as I sympathize with the protesters, I think they have it's a real uphill battle, and I just don't see that as I don't see a happy resolution around the corner. I used to be a much more optimistic and positive guy. I don't know what happened to me, but yes, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Emile. That was a really fantastic survey of what's going on. You overran a bit, but it was so compelling, I just couldn't stop you. I'm going to open up the questions very shortly, but I have one just myself. I'd like to talk a bit more about the international kind of side of it. I'm sure you saw David Ignatius's column in the past few days, where he was basically imploring the US to, do something, save Lebanon, go in there. I think, you used a phrase about get their act together about corruption, something else about corruption. You've already explained quite convincingly why foreign leaders are probably not going to get involved. What is just for us hypothetically assume there was some kind of European or US initiative to be involved in Lebanon, how feasible would it be to, quote, get their act sorted on corruption?
Look, extremely difficult, if not impossible. That doesn't mean they won't try. The French have put forward a reform plan called SED, which I think is quite flawed and doesn't really address what Lebanon needs. But there was interest, in large part because Macron, a year and a half ago, wanted to shore up Hariri, wanted to say this. The concern for a lot of international leaders, and sorry to put it that way, is that if Lebanon were to collapse, even though it's not as strategic as some of the other countries we mentioned, it's going to be headlines. Okay, 10% of traders in the city and half of the designers on Hollywood red carpet and the best food in the world. All this is Lebanese. No, it's true. Lebanon has a way of forcing itself on the agenda in ways that are not necessarily warranted, but that actually constrain what Western policymakers or Arab policymakers and so on can do or not. I mean, it was quite striking for me to see how quickly, televisions in Kuwait and citizens in Jordan and people in the UAE and Saudi and whatever got hooked on it, because Lebanon is culturally meaningful. So people are attached to the story. It resonates more. It's colorful. Half of the protesters are women, so it breaks with what you see elsewhere in the region. It has the sense of greater inclusion, positive, and so on. But there's no clear entry point, because what do you do? With which government do you work? Today, if you work with the Hague government that is under criticism from the protesters, you're sending the message to the protesters that you're with the guys who've ruled for 20, 30 years, are corrupt, created the problem, and so on. So I think it's not the responsibility of the international community in a way, and I don't think this current political class has any of the answers to that. So going to them and saying, look, we'll create incentives or whatever, it will help, I don't think it will work. I still think they'll do it because this is what governments do. It's not their role to pick, who rules here or there. I mean, it's not as if, you have mass massacres in Lebanon and there's need for humanitarian intervention. It's all horrible. It's not that kind of situation. Look, the argument that I have the problem that I have with the U.S. should do something. Well, there was a time to do something, but it's not that time anymore, right? And that's the issue that I have. Is that if you want to do something, it has to do something that makes political and strategic sense. At this point in Lebanon, it's very difficult to see, what the real impetus, incentive is to do that. So, I mean, yeah, on the whole, I'm quite skeptical.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, lots of questions. I'll go around, and if you could just, if I don't know your name, if you could please just introduce yourself in a short sentence about where you're from. Jeremy Bowen, first.
Jeremy Bowen from BBC. I've got first question. You've laid out very clearly that quite a bit of this is circumstances that emerge from within Lebanon's own particular condition. But you did also refer to characteristics that might be shared across the region. I'd say one of them is you talk about the youth of the protesters. One of the big drivers in 2011 for protests was very young populations who are dissatisfied with the lot that they have. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, shared characteristics perhaps of the region. And second of all, your best guess on where it's all going to end. Will it just fizzle out? Bearing in mind the enormous structural issues that it would have that change would, dismantling those structural issues would be necessary before any really fundamental change could happen. And that's a country like Lebanon, once you start changing the confessional system, that's also very dangerous.
Why don't you take those two now, and then we'll go for another round.
Okay, on your first point, I like to compare the uprising since 2011 to a wave. I mean, the wave is the grievances, the demands are similar in the whole region, not just Arab world. I would count, Iran in the mix, and other places that have this large populations and so on. But a wave crashes differently depending on what it crashes onto, right? If it's sand, if it's rock, it will look different, right? So it looks the same while it's in the sea, and then when it crashes, it plays out very differently. So it has to do with things like the military, how strong and institutionalizes it, the political system, how open or not. I mean, again, Lebanon is not a dictatorship. It's not an authoritarian system. That does matter. It's the role of political Islam or other religious institution in case of Lebanon and so on. So it never played out. It always played out differently in every country because it's local circumstances that will dictate how it unfolds, right? At one point, we thought Sudan would turn into a Syria. Actually, it's on a much better track. It's not perfect, but there is a transition that looks substantive, right? Algeria looked. I mean, although it was long and intense and so on, it could look similar to Sudan, or it could be a bit like Tunisia. Who knows on that? Lebanon is in its own category because you've had politics being practiced for a very long time, which is both good and bad. There's a tradition of compromise, but there's also a tradition of brinksmanship, and that's what I worry about. The novelty here is that in Lebanon, like in Iraq, the protest movement really exists outside the established structure, the established political parties, and so on. you will always have people like Muqtada Sadr in Iraq, or Walid Jumblat, or whoever tried to say I represent the movement, or I support the movement, and was trying to raid on the coattails of that one. I don't think that's going to work, but they may actually have a role in shaping where this goes as well. I go back to the issue of entrism and so. Where my best guess of where this goes, my cynical self tells me that the movement is more likely than not to peter out, and that's going to be tragic, because the expectations, the energy, the positive feelings, etc., that you see on in the crowd, the day after, if it doesn't work, all these people are candidates for immigration and say, this is the positive force of the country. These are well-educated, active citizens. They act as citizens. They are engaged. This is exactly what you want, right? People that are politically aware, socially sensitive, and so on. That's where I would. That's what my mind as an analyst tells me. My heart thinks that we're going to win and we'll take everything and it's going to be perfect the next day. But who cares about my heart? I see a heartbreak in the making. But it's not an argument for not trying. That's also is the other thing. It's like the argument on Syria is like, look at the disaster it's been, so people in 2011 should have stopped and not done anything about it. It's like, these things have a life of their own. They generate their own incentives for escalation or not. Let's see where it goes. It's not going to end up into another Syria.
Okay. I think we've got a fair number of questions, so I'm going to take them in groups of three. The first is Khalid Nadim here. If you could give a question, and then I'll take two more after that.
Khalid Nadim, South Asian Police Forum. I'm very concerned about two areas. Young people under 35, and I've met a number of young Lebanese people who are here studying, and they say there is no hope for the young generation in Lebanon. There's no reason for us to go back. We can't get jobs unless my father is a cabinet minister or has got connections. It's better for us to stay in the West. Also, I'm very worried about the impact of this crisis on Syrian refugees in Lebanon today. I believe the West, the Gulf, the US, we have an obligation to support Lebanon financially through a Marshall Plan, because this is affecting the whole of Lebanese society in jobs and education, and we have neglected it. There needs to be an impetus coming from us leading to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE. Can you help us institute a Marshall Plan in Lebanon to help deal with the Syrian refugee crisis and the way that Lebanese people are suffering today?
Okay, great, thank you. Two more questions. Okay, listen, I'll take the lady right at the back first. Yep.
So I'm actually not affiliated with anything, but I'm part of a group of Lebanese people in London that have recently gathered, and the number is growing, trying to collaborate as a Lebanese diaspora. And I think we're trying to see how we can contribute and what the message should be. And so I guess my right now biggest question is, why do you think a technocratic government wouldn't work? And then who are the candidates that are emerging right now that you think are potentially viable, if any?
Okay, good questions. And the gentleman there in the aisle that I'm pointing to at the moment, yes.
David Butter at Chatham House. First I actually was going to ask that question, who are the potential good people who might step in? I'm thinking, would a character like Yassir Jama, for example, from the sort of second tier of existing parties be eligible? The other thing I was interested in is your assessment of the viability of the economic plans. Again, I guess that's repeating the technocratic question, in that some of the points that have been put forward are very familiar, whether it's on the electricity front, whether it's on telecommunications, and they've been blocked for political reasons for over 30 years. In a sense, sensible solutions have been blocked because of the interests in the current way telecoms is run and the people who benefit from it, which is completely counter to any development of the service economy, if that basic plank of development is being hampered. And that goes back to very long time ago, to roughly Hariri's time when he tried to push it through. So can those log jams be broken? And then finally, in that context, it's the burden of taxation, how any sort of revenue-raising exercise should go. I mean, clearly, the whole banking and financial services industry is a sector which could be taxed more effectively, but it's dangerous to do it because the financial flows are so important. But in that context, where are we with the central bank governor? Is it time to bring in somebody new? Would somebody like Jihad Azul from the IMF be fit for that post?
Okay, you've got about 12 minutes to answer about 12 questions, so...
I'll try to. Young people under 35, yes, you're worried about them, they're worried about themselves, and we all worry about them. I mean, it's them. I mean, this is the crowd that we see on the streets. Look, the picture is dire. It's not totally negative, and the fact that they're demonstrating tells you also that they are attached. I keep on reminding people that the lady in the back and me, we have the luxury to pack our suitcase and go elsewhere, but we're still in touch. We train. We're no heroes. It's the guys, and the young ladies who stayed behind and are trying to make a living there, who are the real tough ones. It's not an economy that's generating jobs. It generates smart young graduates who go abroad, do quite well, usually, our resources. But that's perhaps the harshest indictment of Lebanon, is that you have such amazing human talent that doesn't stay, right? Brain drain is perhaps the best way to judge whether a country is performing or not. And clearly here it's underperforming. But I also detect a willingness of a lot of people to take risks, go back, and so on. They just want to make sure that they'll be treated respectfully, that they will have opportunities, that the experience they got abroad can be applied at home, etc. I mean, but the system is skewed from that perspective. Syrian refugees, look, of course, there is an international obligation to support Lebanon. I would say a couple of things. One that is quite controversial. Lebanon, in a way, is a victim of the Syrian conflict, but not only. Lebanon was an active party in the Syrian conflict. The country was split in two. Some were against Assad and some were for Assad. Those who were for Assad were actively engaged in the battlefield in Syria, contributed to humanitarian crisis, and are responsible to a large extent to what happened. And those, by the word those, I mean Hezbollah directly, which has been, this military spearhead on this thing. So Lebanon cannot just portray itself as like, oh, we're poor victims, and we need. It's like we have an active responsibility in that. There was a decision in 2012 to be neutral, and Hezbollah broke that commitment to the rest of the country and exposed the country to jihadi violence, to retaliation, to waves of refugees, and so on. And that created bad blood that will stay forever. The second point is that the campaigns against refugees inside Lebanon should be unacceptable, and the international community should not just put money, but should expect better from Lebanese officials, including the foreign minister and others. The negative discourse on refugees doesn't help anything. It's not going to solve it, and pushing for the return of refugees without safe conditions and fair saying, it's just exposing them to the harshest of punishments. Will the money continue coming in? I suspect a number of countries will stand by it. The refugees are also generate income. The international community has done quite good stuff. Not perfect, and certainly the pressure is there. Certainly the pressure on jobs, on unfair competition, etc. But that's going to be a problem to be managed on the long term. Technocratic government. It depends. You and I can sit down and put together a dream team, and there are some good people out there. But what kind of government are we talking about? Is it transitional government until the next elections? Is it a technocratic government that has a specific mandate in terms of either elections or dealing with the budget crisis and so on? So we say technocratic government. We all love technocrats. Half of the Lebanese are engineers and financiers or whatever. So I'm sure we can find good people. But with what mandate and what process? And this is where the street is having a hard time coming up up with ideas. I mean, like you, I watch those videos where there's this lady who says all the right thing, and at one moment she stops and said, "We want a military government." I'm like, no. The last 3 presidents we had in Lebanon were 3 military men. Does the country feel better? I mean, and does anyone think that senior military officers are good president, good man? I mean, count me skeptical, but so that's the thing. We haven't had this conversation yet internally, and this is where I suspect that I wouldn't be opposed to it on principle. I just think that there's a lot more to explore. Viable candidates. There are names. I'm not going to get really into that. Second-tier people, second-tier politicians, and so on. Yes, but they've been also primary beneficiaries of a lot of those things. They are tainted in a way. I just. To be honest, I don't. They may be named ministers and so on, so that it looks less poisonous. And they're not a solution. You have enough. I mean, you mentioned Jihad Azarwa, for instance. He's the vice president for the MENA region at the IMF. Respected economist, was a minister. Identified with a specific camp, but he is a technocrat from that perspective. Right? Another Christian name is Ziad Bahoud, for instance. He's come back. Left government. He was an interim minister, but was a pretty clean record. No one accuses him of doing anything terrible. And the one time Lebanon had helicopters to fight terrible fires was when he was minister, and then no one cared about those helicopters, which explains the fires of recently. So there are a bunch of names out there. For me, it's like shul tarkibi. How do you put this together? And I'm still quite skeptical, and in part because I personally, and perhaps because I'm in London and not in Beirut, is that I have a hard time identifying who the leaders of this movement is and what their thinking is. I mean, it's typical in Lebanon. You will have your liberals, your lefties, your hyper-nationalists, those who think that Palestine should be first, and those who think that Palestine doesn't care. And it's difficult to know how this crowd ranks the various issues besides the anger. Viability of economic plans. I actually think that if there is a determined push at this moment on electricity and telecom and so on, there is a window of opportunity. The electricity sector, it's unforgivable what has happened, and it's an indictment of the whole country and every minister who's held that portfolio. At this point, I think that the pressure is so big and the focus is so big that something could happen on that. Same thing with telecom. I mean, I think there are ways to manage those entities. My fear is the following. Nothing real will happen in terms of reform, and you will have to pay the debt and whatever. So the state will decide to privatize those assets a la Russia in the 90s, discounted, discounted prices on that, and you will have typical predators in the country who will come and seize them. I mean, I see the reform agenda going downhill because of a lack of, transparency, oversight, political attention. You cannot have, this kind of trajectory without the IMF and the IFC being present, the IFC taking a stake in some of them and imposing some of the rules. But Lebanon, given the presence of Hezbollah and how difficult it's to work with that, the fact that there's so much corruption, and so, how do you get the international organization to come in at a time where the world is turning away from this region and feels? And taxation, I'm glad they taxed the bank, but it was presented almost as like a one-off, like a gift from the banks to help the budget. Banks should be taxed much more harshly in the country. They have sucked the blood of, I mean, it's not that the bank are part of the productive sector. They don't extend a lot of loans. There's not a lot of credit to start companies and so on. So, but again, this is, I think, is a place where there is good momentum if there could be good momentum if there is continued pressure. This is where the international community's role can come, and this is what I would prioritize.
Very good answers. We've got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to take one more on the strict condition that we have a very brief question and a very brief answer, because our Deputy Director General has told me that we're having military timekeeping from now on. So in the second row.
Thank you for your elucidating
talk. My name is Shahab Mossavat. I'm an independent Iranian affairs analyst here in London. You spoke about Ahmadinejad in a very brief way, about civics, civil society in general. Whether this protest movement succeeds or fails, hasn't it exposed the anti-democratic, anti-competitive nature of the historic compromise of power sharing? And aren't its days numbered?
Yes, certainly. I mean, as I said from the beginning, is that people have identified the political system as generating all this corruption, mismanagement, and so on. The problem is not necessarily with power sharing as such. Power sharing should not be seen as a bad concept, bad name. It's application, right? It's how you say. So it can be quite problematic. I can give you tons of examples where very qualified people were denied positions because of the sectarian distribution of positions and so on. So that certainly is the case. And I would argue that probably most of the crowd is non-sectarian from that perspective. But saying non-sectarian, it's good. It's not enough, and that's where we have to be careful about when we study the Middle East, we often conflate concepts, right? You can be non-sectarian, you can be secular and still be sectarian. You can be non-sectarian and be quite authoritarian, right? We saw this with the Ba'ath Party and supposedly, and then those identities shift and so on. So what I want to say is that power sharing in and of itself is not the big problem. And look, a number of Lebanese, whether they're Christians or Muslims or whatever, have a sense of pride, by the way, when the only head of state in the Arab League who is not Muslim is a Lebanese. And by the way, the president is not that powerful in the system, so that doesn't, it's not that it's a Christian dictatorship in the country, right? It's unfair. It's a profoundly unfair system, but it is not a brutal dictatorship. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had an event on Iraq. Well, there was a time when Iraqis thought, perhaps the Lebanese system is the way to go. Well, no. Again, like 2 weeks ago, we said the only thing you should import from Lebanon is Lebanese food. What I can tell you now is also Lebanese sense of humor, and the protests. These are the two things people are allowed to, not the political system.
Yes, well, on that cheery note, Emile, thank you so much for this. I'd like to thank the audience for their great questions, and I'd like to ask them to join me in thanking Emile for his fantastic talk.